ancient Mars apparently was warm and rainy enough to support life. And this is interesting because it kind of tracks along with some of David Flynn's research. He had an idea that Mars may have been populated by angelic civilizations in the ancient past. So this news coming out now is pretty interesting. We'll touch on it briefly, but also our good friend Tim Alberino, previously on Multiverse, found something interesting on Mars. So we'll get to that in a minute. But first it says, it's long been established that Mars once had water on its surface, but a new study suggests that between 3 and 4 billion years ago, the red planet was warm and wet enough to have massive rainstorms and flowing water, an environment that may have supported life. The new study presented at Goldschmidt Geochemistry Conference in Barcelona compares mineral deposit patterns on Mars with those seen on Earth to support the hypothesis. So Purdue University professor Bryony Horgan said in a statement, quote, "We know there were periods when the surface of Mars was frozen. We know there were periods when water flowed freely," end quote. So here's a picture. This is the site of the Mars 2020 landing, chemical alteration by water. So on ancient Mars, water covered channels and transportation and transported sediments to form fans and deltas within lake basins. So color enhanced to show mineral types. So you can see that there. So Horgan continued, quote, "But we don't know exactly when these periods were and how long they lasted. We have never sent unmanned missions to areas of Mars which can show us these earliest rocks, so we need to use earthbound science to understand the geochemistry of what might have happened there. Our study of weathering in radically different climate conditions such as the Oregon Cascades, Hawaii, Iceland, and other places on Earth can show us how climate affects pattern of mineral deposition like we see on Mars." So it continues on after that. It really gets into the science of how they discovered this. But if that is true, is it possible that what David Flynn was saying was correct? Is there actual evidence of ancient civilizations on Mars? Well, my lovely, beautiful wife, Christina, and we interviewed Timothy Alberino a couple of years ago on what he said was a Morse code that was found on Mars, and it falls right in line with this question. So watch this.
NASA released a photo, very unusual photo, of the surface of Mars under the heading Morse code on Mars. And the media ran with this story as if they were instructed to run with this story under the heading of Morse code on Mars, and they made a big deal about it, wondering is this image that NASA released, this image here, which I have a file for you to put on the screen of it. Is this representative of some kind of numerical language such as Morse code? Now, it was stated tongue-in-cheek, both by NASA and then by the media outlets, many of the major media outlets that ran this story. And even in NASA's own article, if you go to NASA's website, you'll see the heading Morse code on Mars, and then you'll read the article where they basically debunk the idea that this is Morse code on Mars.
So they put forth the idea, and then they go and debunk their own.
To debunk it and say, no, this is just the result of wind patterns and the natural formation of the sand and so forth, which doesn't really make a difference in the overarching point that I want to make, which is this so-called Morse code on Mars is analogous with what is known as the geoglyphs of Tiwanaku.
And that's something that you and Steve covered in True Legends, the first one, Technology of the Fallen.
Right, based on an article written by David Flynn, 2012, entitled The Geoglyphs of Tiwanaku, which Tom Horn commented out in the book, the David Flynn Collection. And Tom's comment was right. He said something to the effect that this is one of the most astounding discoveries made in the modern era concerning something that could potentially be very ancient. And I agreed with that, with Tom's assessment of what David Flynn discovered, using satellite imagery that was just coming online at the time, the high resolution stuff. He discovered these geoglyphs, and what they are raised ridge lines, and also, I'm sorry, not ridge lines. They're lines that are raised and with the earth, like as if they were constructed lines and dots and hills on the surface of the earth, but also dug into the bedrock of the earth. So you have these lines that are both raised mounds and also dug into the bedrock, forming these very intricate and interesting shapes and dots.
So completely different than what we would see, say, at like the Sahara Desert or something.
Yeah,
just from wind patterns.
Very different.
Wow.
Yeah, normally, like if you look at wind patterns in the desert, they're going to look wavy,
Right.
depending on which way the wind is blowing, which is exactly what you see in the ocean and so forth. When you have wind movement, you have usually a uniform direction that things are moving in. So it's very unlikely that these patterns that we see on the surface of Mars, whether they're sand or something else, are natural.
Right.
And it's very likely, in my mind, that they are in fact artificial, that they were created, especially when you compare them with the geoglyphs of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, which of course nobody has.
Right.
So, and I'm speaking in terms of the mainstream media and of NASA themselves. So. It's bizarre when you compare the two. When you compare the geoglyphs of Tiwanaku with the image that came out from NASA of Mars, you may be looking at, it's very possible that you're looking at the same language, the same code. Is it some kind of a numerical code like Morse code? We believe it is, and that's what we postulated in the first episode of our documentary series, True Legends.
Wow. Now does the what was found in Bolivia, does that represent any kind of known code or
No,
or
nothing
any kind
known.
of repetition?
Nothing known, but we have a feeling, and so did David Flynn, that it might be akin to the language that the only form of written language that the Inca had, which was called quipus. It wasn't really written; it was a series of beads and strings. And it was a very intricate form of communication. I mean, they could have the history of kings and the lineage of kings, and on a string so it's like a string with other strings attached to it at varying lengths, and knots and beads. Usually knots, but also beads, so it was a form of numeric language.
Oh, wow.
Quipus was. And not only quipus, there's something else that's associated with quipus, and the name of it escapes me, but it's again from the Inca, which I think the Inca were given that knowledge, and they were using a language that existed before they invented it, so to speak. So this other form of calculating by the Inca involves squares and dots. Which is exactly, if you combine quipus, which is the ropes and the knots and the beads and so forth, with the other form of the mathematical calculations that the Inca were making using this series of squares and dots, and they were beads, like marbles almost, squares and marbles. You put them together, and that appears to be what is represented in both the Bolivian geoglyphs of Tiwanaku and the so-called Morse code on Mars.
So really interesting stuff. We're going to have to keep our eye on Mars and see what news develops, because it does seem like there was something strange going on there in the ancient past. I don't know exactly what, but it's definitely interesting.